Ever felt like the United States is feeling even more like a fascist dystopia than usual? Join your host for a dive into the roots of the modern American right and why that matters. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Smith, and you are listening to The Wayward Wanderer. The past month and a half has seen an escalating wave of increasingly radical action by increasingly far-right conservatives in positions of power at all levels in the United States of America, beginning with Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, and his war on trans youth, which was followed shortly after by Florida's notorious Don't Say Gay bill and their war on the Disney Corporation. That further kicked into high gear with the leaked draft of a Supreme Court decision that appears to be effectively repealing the earlier Roe versus Wade ruling of the Supreme Court, which legalizes and protects the right to abortion, and the language of the draft opinion, which includes some really hair-raising stuff about increasing the supply of babies up for adoption, and has some pretty strong implications of going after additional rights such as gay marriage, privacy, and a whole host of other things. And then, of course, we had the Buffalo mass shooting and several other mass shootings, including the most recent, which has seen bad actors on the far right, from 4chan all the way up to Congressman Paul Gosar attempting to pin a massacre of elementary school children on a random trans person they found on Reddit. And then there's all of the Fugitive Slave Act inspired trigger legislation, or even stuff that's under debate in state capitals right now that would empower right-wing state governments to send law enforcement officers after anyone who, tries to cross state lines to get an abortion in a state where it is legal, or seek gender-affirming care, or get away from Greg Abbott's war on queer kids. All of this is adding up to an American right that looks pretty clearly like they're going on the attack on every front, and they are confident that this will stick. You're probably wondering at this point, why is this heathen podcaster digging into where all this stuff is coming from, at least within, the last 60, 70 years? You probably are even thinking, well, what does this have to do with heathenry and paganism, aside from the whole, all of this very directly impacts everybody who is living in the United States right now in a lot of ways that they may not necessarily appreciate. But to the question of why does understanding this stuff matter to modern heathens is one that's answered by the close relationship between the development and the different strains of the American right and far right, and the origins of neo-Volkish, or sometimes referred to as Folkish, Asatru, Folkish Heathenry, and Folkish spirituality. Though the ideas behind these movements have deeper late 19th century roots, not much deeper, mind, the fact is, the modern Folkish movement is very heavily influenced by the development of the American right, and this is extended throughout the movement, first by the fact that Folkish Asatru's most prominent and organized promoter, Stephen McNallen, was and is an American, and most of his organization is based out of the United States. And then because of the effective globalization of the far right that has been happening over the last 20 years, which among other things, has seen a lot of these concepts that percolated in the American far right exported to the rest of the global far right. A lot of, for example, the anti-trans rhetoric that is coming out of the Republican Party is also echoed by Viktor Orban's government in Hungary, by Vladimir Putin's Russia, and many other similar right-wing governments around the world. Before even going into the whole mess that is the way that the American Christian right has funded some, well, as it's been called, kill the gays bills in different parts of Africa, like Uganda. What I'm hoping for by digging into this is to both help anyone who's in or adjacent to this community understand the ways that our own homegrown racism problem is a reflection and is also kind of fed into these movements in its own ways, and to give a sense of what we can do to navigate these waters, particularly to understand what has to be done in the face of a full court press by the American right. Another way to think of this is, if the problems with fascism, racism, patriarchy, and everything else within heathenry are a reflection of what's going on in broader society, then you could also argue that some of what has been starting to work can then be applied and duplicated in broader society. Before I really dive in, I'd first like to give a quick thank you to all of my patrons who are basically helping pay for the server and the website bills, which makes it easier for me to do this work. If you are interested in helping grow that support and make it easier for me to do more of this kind of content creation and making good trouble, then please head on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you 1 week advance access to podcast episodes and increasing benefits as more patrons jump on board. So for basically the price of a cup of coffee each month, you help keep me on the air and keep this signal going out. So all of that said, broadly speaking, the way I'm going to be talking about the U.S. right is in terms of, you could say, sort of the three big strains that you see playing out in the coalition that is the Republican Party and the American far right. And these are best described as the American Christian fundamentalist movement, also referred to as the Dominionist movement, though these aren't quite the same thing. At this point, it's a distinction with minimal difference. What is often referred to as the Militia Movement. And finally, the, I guess you could say, new Jim Crow wing, which is both folks who never really let go of the Jim Crow system to begin with, or are looking to create some kind of revitalized version in the present day. You may be wondering, what about the market economics guys, like the people that are all about like absolutely unrestrained capitalism? One thing I've found that's pretty consistent across these groups, so there are some exceptions when you're talking about specific elements of the American far right, that most of these groups are extremely into really turbocharged forms of capitalism and intensified exploitation. Each of these groups, without exception, embraces a return to a kind of Gilded Age capitalism for different reasons. The really short version for each is, for, the fundamentalists, that means that people have to depend more on the church for social supports. From the perspective of sort of the new Jim Crow types, that means you get to be even more terrible to people who don't count as white and make money off of it, by the way. And when you're talking the militia types, it sort of appeals to the whole, yeoman farmer fantasy / I get to absolutely squeeze every last drop out of this oil well that I inherited from my granddaddy because he struck it rich in the right spot and had enough capital to hold on to the thing. One thing that is kind of consistent, and I won't be able to get too much into this aspect in this episode, but I want to put this out there as just something to think about, is the really hyper-capitalist nature of American conservatism means that each of the different factions have seriously grifter elements to them. And what I mean by this is, and this is not to say other forms of fascism in other parts of the world are not a grift in their own way, but that when you dig pretty deep with a lot of these different groups, you consistently find that there is a lot of horrible shit that goes on, or abuses that are perpetrated, or even just like, straight up scams and cons inflicted on the followers of these movements that root back to making as much money as possible for the people at the top. When your baseline setting is greed is good, and that is part of the social environment you're coming out of, then it makes sense that the most reactionary political tendencies are also going to have elements of greasing palms and filling pockets as much as possible. Also, if you're looking for more material on any of these different topics and what's going to get covered along the way, please check out the recommended supplemental materials in the episode description, which includes a podcast, a Netflix documentary, and several different books. One thing I also want to point out is the distinctions between the groups that I've made are more describing general tendencies, influences, and schools of thought, I guess you could say. These aren't exactly hard lines, and as this episode goes, you're going to see that there's quite a bit of blurring of boundaries between these different groups and ways that they overlap and influence each other. So first off is the new Jim Crow. Now, without getting too much into the history of the original Jim Crow, because that is both well beyond the scope of today's episode, and there's whole libraries of stuff that's been written on this. So what I'm going to get into here is just some bullet points for understanding more what you could call the modern new Jim Crow movement, which emerges after the struggle for civil rights in the 1960s. For the extremely short version, the original Jim Crow system was imposed across the former Confederate States of America through a combination of extra-legal violence, insurgency warfare by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and eventually the North just sort of giving up on continuing the project of Reconstruction. The withdrawal of federal troops didn't immediately lead to the collapse of the gains made by Reconstruction, and there were movements like the Populist Party in the American South that in some place and throughout other rural parts of the U.S. that sought to build a sort of farmers' alliance that went across racial lines to challenge the power of different entrenched rural elites, along with things like the Union Leagues, organized black militias, and all kinds of other attempts at holding on to the gains made under Reconstruction. When Jim Crow came into power starting in the 1880s and consolidating itself in the 1890s with the Supreme Court ruling Plessy v. Ferguson. Yeah, it turns out what's coming down the pike in June is far from the first time that the Supreme Court has mostly been an instrument of rolling back rights rather than protecting them. But anyway, the way that this system was implemented was to restore as much as possible the total disenfranchisement of Black Americans, to render them into a state that was pretty close to slavery, and some historians have argued in terms of the sort of violence and terror that was meted out on the Black population may have potentially been worse. That also brought with it the largest rollback of the voting franchise in American history up to that point, both in deliberately stripping voting rights from the recently freed black population, and also from lower class subsistence farming or even landless whites in the South. A sort of broad-based counteroffensive and entrenchment of an apartheid system that would go on to do things like inspire the Nuremberg race laws in Nazi Germany. One particular highlight of Jim Crow, particularly in the American South, was the conversion of the Confederate Home Guard, which was basically a secret police force / slave hunting patrol, into the backbone of the new local police and sheriff's departments. There's also a lot of former Confederate veterans, supporters of the Confederacy, and others who scatter themselves across the American West and take their ideas with them, some of whom go on to start some of these different police departments in different parts of the United States of America. Lots of things about American policing make a lot more sense when you take into account how many departments were started by people whose main interest was controlling black people. These ideas became mainstreamed through things like the Dunning School of History, which created this whole Solid South lost cause mythology that sort of has recycled itself repeatedly through American conservatism, of this idea of there being an earlier time when men were men and women were women, and anyone who was not white enough was not in the picture. All of this is made possible thanks to an implicit bargain that was made between the Democratic and Republican parties after the end of Reconstruction that essentially went something to the effect of the Republicans won't look too closely at whatever it is that's happening in the South, and the Democrats will accept the degree of dominance and power that the Republican Party had established for themselves at the federal level. And the two would find ways to work together on things like slaughtering indigenous Americans, starting wars with Spain, and all that other fun stuff. What's important for understanding Jim Crow in terms of how it functioned as a political system, aside from the obvious massive and legally entrenched marginalization of specific groups within Jim Crow society, is that it forms a kind of illiberal democracy that's very similar to apartheid South Africa, Viktor Orban's Hungary, and Vladimir Putin's Russia. Meaning that while there are elections, there are elected officials, and there is certainly the possibility that people in power could lose their positions, in practice, all the real decisions of who is and is not suitable to be put forward to office are decided well before the ballots are printed. One particularly American practice in all of this is what's referred to as gerrymandering, which is possible because, of course, in American democracy, the people who get to set their district lines are the people who hold office in those districts. What this generally means is you get districts that will look something like a salamander, which is where the term comes from, or some other kind of different animal, like stretching itself across the map and doesn't really have much rhyme or reason or connection to existing communities. This serves to dilute certain voting blocks, concentrate other ones, and protect the power of the incumbents who draw the maps. It is important to point out that some of these practices were not unique to the South. Gerrymandering, for example, was invented in Massachusetts in the late 1700s. And many close to Jim Crow practices like redlining, homeowners compacts, and all kinds of other fun stuff proliferate throughout the United States during this period. So even though you have states that are formally not Jim Crow states, they still have similar rates of things like violence against Black Americans or violence against other groups like Chinese Americans, which started in the great state of California. But all of it was particularly intense and most fully applied in the Jim Crow South. The civil rights movement of the 1960s brought a lot of significant federal reforms and court rulings to bear that broke down these legal edifices and structures. But what it did not do was effectively remove the long-standing social forces that made the Jim Crow system possible, or dismantle the long-standing racial biases handed down from officer to officer in Jim Crow police departments and others that were influenced by Jim Crow practices, ideas, and methods. Groups like the Third Ku Klux Klan, which rose during the 50s and 60s to serve as an insurgency army / unofficial brown shirts for Jim Crow, and then the later Fourth Klan, which emerged after the collapse of the Third Klan towards the end of the 1960s, could be seen as the most visible examples of this movement going underground. They certainly weren't the only ones. And there are, in fact, plenty of Republican Party officials, like Mitch McConnell, who got their start in public service at the tail end of the Jim Crow era and were raised in well-to-do white families who profited from Jim Crow. In many ways, the reforms of the civil rights era managed to break the official edifices, but for a variety of reasons, did not fully uproot the social networks, the economic patronage systems, or anything else that supported the ideas and movements behind this. And this, by the way, as you're getting into the 60s and 70s and well before that even, is when you start seeing things like the Pioneer Fund and other actively far-right dark money / think tank groups start popping up that receive funds from insanely wealthy industrialists. Like, for example, the Richard Mellon Scaife estate. Or Henry Ford back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s when he was actively promoting things like the anti-conspiracy theory tract known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. These guys were pushed under, but they weren't really effectively uprooted. Kind of like how Reconstruction in a lot of ways didn't go far enough. And now we have the folks on the right who are taking up the mantle of the previous Jim Crow types, who are replicating things like incredibly tilted gerrymandering, stacking the courts, and all kinds of other fun stuff that, even though it's not explicitly racially motivated, is sort of adding up to look a lot like Jim Crow, rebooted and revamped for the 21st century. Where this shows up when we're talking the Volkish movement is pretty much everywhere. Like the whole idea of a religion that is only for white people, the concept of metagenetics, all of this sort of like really muddled race science, that all is ported directly from Jim Crow. And it's very appropriate to refer to folkish practice as a Jim Crow spirituality. This is also reinforced by likely influences on Stephen McNallen and others from apartheid South Africa, which, again, was inspired by the Jim Crow system of the American South. Even the notion of white ethnostates, which has long been promoted by the white nationalist movement, could be seen as applying the logic of Jim Crow to the logic of a nation state, of saying we need to have these designated as black enclaves over here and these designated as white ones over here, and never the twain shall meet. To circle back to the Jim Crowists, this is where conservative and fundamentalist Christianity comes into the picture. Now, Again, we're going to have to jump back a bit, back again to the late 1800s, early 1900s, when you see the birth of modern Christian fundamentalism in the United States of America. Now, it needs to be said, and this is something that Katherine Stewart gets into in a lot of detail in The Power Worshippers, that there had already been a really long established relationship between religious authorities and maintaining different racist power structures like slavery and Jim Crow. Even though there are many examples of Christian preachers and clerics who fought for the abolitionist cause, there are also as many, and for much of U.S. history prior to the American Civil War, more who were happily quoting Bible verses about how slaves should be obedient to their masters and servants should obey orders, and all should render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, to justify the horrors and brutality of the institution of slavery. This is stuff that is not new for these guys. So when we're getting to the fundamentalist Christian movement, this is emerging as Jim Crow is being codified, not just in the Jim Crow South, but throughout the United States. And it's part of a broader reaction that you see throughout the industrializing world, particularly as the theory of evolution, as promoted by Charles Darwin and then other naturalists and biologists, spread worldwide. One of the most famous examples of when these things clash is what's referred to as the Scopes monkey trial, where two of the most famous attorneys of their era, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, clashed in a Tennessee courthouse in 1925 over a teacher's right to teach the theory of evolution, and whether the existing law in the state of Tennessee banning the teaching of evolution was constitutional. And, you know, if you at any point wandered through the modern atheist movement or grew up in the 90s, some of this may sound familiar in the form of intelligent design and creationism. Essentially, these guys were rising because of what they saw as the crowding out of God's place in society and the public sphere, and also because they were clashing with more liberal forms of Christian scripture, which focused heavily on things like interpreting the Bible based on historic context, looking at the writings of early church fathers, and sort of what you could call a more academic approach to biblical studies. The fundamentalists argued that all that was necessary was the literal word of God, which is an idea that, you know, goes all the way back to Martin Luther and the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation, and you don't need anything else for understanding the word of God. Now, initially, these movements, and you see things like the Pentecostals and a lot of the modern American evangelical movement, but also like, you know, the Southern Baptist Convention and others, focused in these earlier days on creating, you could say, godly society, and to an extent removing themselves from political affairs. Like, these folks absolutely had influence at the local and regional level, and certainly exerted pressure because, you know, churches have always been fairly powerful institutions in American society. But there wasn't quite this drive towards imposing Christian morality through law. There was much more of a sense of there's the secular world, which was sort of seen as unclean and sinful, and then there is living within the light of God and the sweet baby Jesus. And that was seen more as that, you know, if you preach and you spread the good word and the gospel and all that, then you're going to get there. And it wasn't necessary to go through the levers of power. This starts changing in the 1930s, when different businessmen like the DuPonts are watching as Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal is completely redefining politics. His party is in basically uncontested control over much of the United States of America, and the influence of business is seriously on the wane for the first time since the beginning of the Gilded Age in a big way. And one thing that was big about how Roosevelt sold his pitch and the New Deal was through his use of Christianity and references to the Bible of things like Jesus chasing the money changers from the temple, and a lot of the other more, you could say, economically leveling, be good to the poor stuff that's all over the place in the New Testament. And if you want a lot more details on this stuff, the podcast Behind the Bastards has a great three-parter on this particular angle. But the short version is you start seeing these different wealthy groups throwing money at pastors who are preaching out against the godless socialism of Roosevelt and his New Deal. This doesn't gain much traction at first in the 30s and 40s because, well, you know, everybody very strongly remembered this thing called the Wall Street stock market crash of 1929 and how badly that left everybody off. And also that, you know, even for groups that were heavily marginalized in American society, how the New Deal brought genuine improvement to the lives of a lot of people. For anyone who's more into the American political history side of things, this is also when what's called the Great Realignment is getting started, which basically refers to the movement of black voters away from the Republican Party and towards the Democratic Party, and the end of the so-called solid Democratic South. Like, that comes to head in the 1960s, but even as early as the 1930s, you start already seeing majorities of black voters going for Roosevelt's programs, because even though the New Deal was definitely racist and had all kinds of loopholes in places that directly left out black America, the programs and everything the New Deal was doing, including things like protections for labor rights, still did lead to significant material improvements for the lives of black Americans, along with a lot of other Americans. And this is also when you see like the consolidation of the labor movement behind the Democratic Party and the creation of this sort of enduring New Deal consensus. Now, these guys continue to build their influence and develop their networks, particularly their media apparatuses. This is like, you know, Jerry Falwell and all of them start getting started in the 50s and 60s as televangelists. This is when you get folks like Jim Baker, who unfortunately is still with us, and Tammy Faye Baker, who was significantly less bad than Jim and is no longer with us, who are spreading the word of God by whatever means they can find. Also, there's lots of grifting and quite a few high-profile scandals, including of Jim Baker, that involve things like these different high-powered televangelists grifting money off of their unsuspecting parishioners. What politically gives these guys a kick in the pants, and it's worth mentioning folks like Jerry Falwell, were not on the right side of history during the civil rights movement, is Roe v. Wade. Now, before Roe v. Wade, one of the big things that this movement was fighting for and had lost at the Supreme Court level was using religion as a justification for maintaining Jim Crow-style segregation in the classroom. This, however, was increasingly a losing proposition, and then when the Supreme Court struck it down, you had folks like Paul Weyrich and others within the Christian right as it was developing, looking for a new cause to anchor themselves on. And what they found was abortion. Now, before Roe v. Wade, the main Christian denomination in the United States that was vocally opposed to the legalization of abortion was the Catholic Church. And this is in line with a lot of other stuff that's deeply held within Catholic theology. Like, you can criticize the Catholic Church on a lot of things, on their social policies and stuff, but at least when it comes to their stance on abortion, it's also consistent with their stance on things like the death penalty and any kind of taking of a human life. You can vehemently disagree with it, but at least there's like a certain internal consistency. Not saying it's justified or excusable, certainly not in a heathen context, but I will give at least that measure of respect and recognition that it's been a thing for them for a while. Most of American Protestant Christianity, however, was pretty lukewarm about the whole issue or even supportive. In fact, you can go back into the archives and see that when Roe versus Wade was decided, the Southern Baptist Convention, who are one of the loudest denominations calling for the end of Roe versus Wade in the United States, issued an opinion that was basically like, yeah, this is fine. I mean, really, there's no problem here. It took deliberate action by people like Paul Weyrich, Falwell, Pat Robertson, and lots of these other folks to change that consensus and to push the conversation within a span of less than a decade from this is mostly a Catholic issue to this is a unifying issue of the Christian right and the central animating issue of this movement. And, you know, it is also one that's way easier to scream about in public than I don't want black kids in my classroom. These folks then began waging a campaign against Roe versus Wade on every level of things like recruiting and training up justices for appointment to the federal bench and the Supreme Court who would support things like overturning Roe versus Wade, putting prayer back in the classroom, you know, school mandated prayer, which, you know, anyone who's a heathen should have serious problems with that because that never is going to mean our kind of prayer. And all the window dressing that helps obscure the close alliance between a lot of these like neo-Jim Crow groups and the Christian right. In some cases, the Venn diagram is a single circle. They're also, it has to be said, very white dominated and have been leading the charge on things like the war on LGBT rights since the inception of the gay rights movement, pushing for things like taking critical race theory out of schools and all kinds of other things that align with really a lot of the priorities of sort of the new Jim Crow types. Now, if you're looking for what is sort of the core thing that's going on here, in the case of the new Jim Crow people, it's pretty clearly of restoring something that is similar to the lost golden age of the antebellum South or something similar. In the case of the Christian fundamentalists, the real thing that's going on here more than anything else, and this is broad strokesing all over the place, would be patriarchy. Specifically, maintaining the power of the head of the household, who is, by the way, always a man, specifically a white man, if you're talking these guys. This isn't to say all Christian fundamentalists in the United States are white, but it is worth pointing out that the most powerful figures within it are white, and the vast majority of this movement is white. So there's a lot of implicit whiteness or white norms that goes into their image of patriarchy, which, you know, is all about let's restore the power of the head of household over the family. The way this intersects with things like abortion is restoring power over the women within the family and eliminating their autonomy. When this runs into things like the gay rights movement is on restricting the autonomy of their children and getting to define their children according to the way they see it. Like, when you really think about it, all of this, it's for the children and for the family rhetoric that comes out of this movement is very honest. They're just talking about a different kind of family that looks kind of like a small corporation when you think about it. You also see this notion of family values and gender roles and everything is all over the place in the Folkish movement, even though these notions of gender and family structure and just basic human autonomy are ones that are very Christian in origin, fairly historically recent, and don't really reflect any of what is present in surviving source material. One particularly well-known example of these kind of prejudices being mapped backwards onto pre-conversion sources is the insistence that Tacitus in his Germania describes the Germanic tribes executing people who were accused of being gay by throwing them into bogs, when the actual word that's used in there doesn't really have specific associations with how we would describe homosexuality. And as far as anyone can tell, the first source for that was Heinrich Himmler. So, great stuff. Totally traditional Christian values, but we're going to slap an Odin and Thor and Balder paint job on the top. This then gets to sort of the third leg of what you could call the American right, and that is the militia movement. Now, the militia movement bases their mythology on sort of this whole like frontier yeoman on the prairie kind of mythology that was used for justifying the expropriation and elimination of indigenous peoples across much of what is the continental United States. This, by the way, is one of the other places that a lot of police departments trace their origins to. Quite a few organizations, like the Texas Rangers, first cut their teeth on waging genocidal war against local indigenous groups. Again, things start to make a lot more sense about American policing when part of it was set up by guys who wanted to control black people, and the other part was set up by white guys who wanted to kill indigenous people. The modern militia movement, which Kathleen Belew gets into more detail on in her book, Bringing the War Home, can be seen as echoing back to this, as well as things like frontier posses, which, again, were frequently for things like lynch mobs. But the real modern start comes from the Cold War. During the Second Red Scare of the 1950s, you had groups like the John Birch Society, who were promoting all kinds of conspiracy theories. If you've ever seen, for example, Dr. Strangelove, that reference from the General Ripper who goes completely off the range and says, I'm starting nuclear war, about communist plots to sap our vital fluids, is a direct lift from the John Birch Society's campaign against fluoridation of public water as a public health measure. Hey, it turns out conspiracy theories about public health is also as American as the KKK and arguing about evolution in a courtroom. This whole fetid fever swamp of different conspiracy theories and anti-communist rhetoric begins to spawn this notion of that it will be necessary for some kind of insurgency war to be waged by proper red-blooded Americans to stop the communist takeover driven by the enemy within. Which, for those keeping score at home, is a really fascist way of looking at the world. Sounds a lot like the Nazi Party's line about the war against the Jewish race, and a lot of other fun stuff. These guys are particularly important when you're talking about the Neo-Volkish or the Folkish movement, because these were some of the guys that Stephen McNellan first targeted for recruitment. Never forget, he first plugged his Viking Brotherhood in Soldier of Fortune magazine, which is big, particularly in the 70s and 80s with this crowd. Now, there is, of course, crossover between elements of the militia movement with sort of the new Jim Crow types, neo-Nazis, Christian dominionists. Again, there's places where all these guys rub elbows and overlap, though they aren't necessarily all of the same thing. One of the big animating issues for the militia movement is gun control. I'm not going to get into all of the ins and outs and particulars of American gun culture, both because that's way outside of my wheelhouse, and I just do not have the time and space within this episode to do that any justice. If there is somebody who'd like to come on and talk about this particular aspect more, I'd love to have you. The militia movement has long seen attempts by the federal government to regulate gun ownership and specific types of firearms as infringements on civil liberties and as an echo of attempts by British redcoats to seize firearms from the colonial Minutemen at the beginning of the American War of Independence. For these guys, the idea of arms confiscation as the first sign of an impending dictatorship is extremely consistent and runs throughout the movement, regardless of the specific interpretation. And you see particularly accelerationist elements of this movement who advocate for things like Christchurch or the Buffalo mass shooting to exacerbate those tensions and create a situation where the proper gun owners of America will finally realize the tyranny and rise up. Now, there's definitely conspiracism all over the place in the other elements of the American right, but arguably it's within the spaces of the militia movement that it really comes into full flower. That said, I don't want to give the implication that the militia movement is necessarily more inclined towards violence or extralegal action than any of the other strains. After all, if we look to dominionist Christianity, we can see the continuous war against abortion providers that's been waged since the 1970s that has included bombings, assassinations, and even like an attempted terrorist attack against the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia. And, well, you could say that the new Jim Crow types absolutely have their own trail of bodies that goes from the KKK to much of the American neo-Nazi movement and everybody in between. All that said, if any one of these strains has the most influence on the sort of shape and appearance and aesthetic of, you could say, the more armed and militaristic wings of the American right, it usually comes from the militia movement and is drawn from the militia movement, even though this movement absolutely intermixes and mingles all of the stuff from the other two, and then some. Another big one for the militia movement is immigration. Historically, though Jim Crow South and all of them were totally fine with restrictions on immigration, things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, deportation of Mexican migrants and everything else, it wasn't as central for that ideology as is the case with, say, the militia movement, largely because the Jim Crow movement, when it was in its height, had the power to basically brutalize and chase out these different groups. And historically, the Jim Crow South received a significantly smaller share of immigrants from outside the United States because there really wasn't much in the way of jobs or social opportunities or any of that stuff in the rigidly segregated and structured society of the Jim Crow South. This isn't to say groups like the Klan were not anti-immigrant. They absolutely were in a massive way. It's just that that was one more thing on the plate, and the central point was maintaining the order of Jim Crow. For the militia movement, immigration takes a more significant space in terms of like the ideas and all that, though, again, these are things that have since leveled out into the modern American right, such as it is. In part because as the militia movement was, getting its feet wet in the 60s and 70s is when you had the 1965 Immigration Act, which removed a whole bunch of previous quotas and made it possible for a lot of people to legally immigrate to the United States from places like East Asia that previously were under tight restrictions. This then blends into the Great Replacement theory, which is coming out of sort of the Jim Crow white right to an extent, but also from these guys, and helps get you into the snowball we have now. And also the place where particularly you could say that the Folkish movement is, at least was having a feedback loop into this, is in serving as something of a safe haven for these ideas and promoting them in different ways that sort of fell beneath notice and gave a place for these ideas to really develop. Though, in fairness, it would be a gross exaggeration to say that the Folkish movement was responsible for making this possible. All this shit was already developing without them. They just gave one more place for it to safely percolate and organize, which was further aided and abetted by other elements of the heathen and pagan communities that looked the other way. So that brings us to the present day. Christian fundamentalism's campaign to take the 7 mountains of society, which they refer to as religion, family, education, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business, is accelerating through the court system. Organizations like the Federalist Society have created an effective pipeline for introducing increasingly far-right judges directly into the federal judiciary, and this apparatus has no counterpart anywhere within the Democratic Party, within the broader American left, or anything else. This has gone hand in hand with their escalating legal and illegal campaign against support for queer communities, for abortion rights, and for enabling these other parts of the American right. New Jim Crow ideology is effectively being put in place in multiple states across the U.S., where things like voter ID laws, extreme gerrymandering, and the use of felony convictions, which now is going to include seeking an abortion, and in some places, gender-affirming care, denies people the right to vote. Or, where people can vote, that vote doesn't really matter, because a lot of the key decisions have already been made before the ballots were printed. The level of saturation has also completely swamped the Republican Party. Nothing better confirmed this than when CPAC, which is one of the biggest political conservative conferences in the United States, is hosting a convention in Hungary and brought Viktor Orban, the very illiberal strongman in control in Hungary, on stage to preach about how Hungary has destroyed the liberal agenda and has crushed the menace of the globalists. This is a party who is being pushed by the key components of their coalition towards open authoritarianism and fascism. It also has to be said, contrary to the best hopes of a lot of more liberally minded listeners to this podcast, this return to vote suppression, harassment, and legal marginalization would be a return to the norm for what was much of American history. In short, the American right has effectively gamed the American constitutional system, exploited anti-democratic elements of American democracy, and forged alliances with wealthy and powerful people that is now on the march towards imposing a form of minority rule, restricted franchise, and the active legal marginalization of whole swaths of people who previously enjoyed growing civil rights protections. This is all exactly what it looks like. So what does this mean? How can we go forward and move through this and overcome this? Well, I can't give all the answers on here, but I can say one thing that is a powerful lesson that was repeatedly learned the hardest way possible in heathenry. You cannot compromise with fascists. Any negotiations with fascists will be used by fascist groups to open new ways towards power. Debating them gives them a platform for promoting their ideas and propaganda. And regardless of how good and reasonable or personable over a mug of beer or a horn of mead they were with you personally, is not and will never be a sign of the broader movement coming to their senses and reaching a place of reasonable accommodation. The only thing that has ever worked is naming this for what it is and fighting it by whatever means you have available. The heathen community tried being reasonable and compromising and reaching out to the better angels of their nature and all that other stuff for years with the Folkish movement, decades even. And none of that moved the dial an inch on addressing the deep problems that came from the bigotries they promoted and were tolerated throughout heathenry. Circumstances only began changing when people stopped playing nice, stopped playing by rules of civility that only benefited the fascists, and started fighting back. And they did that in every level and way that they possibly could. The Asatru Folk Assembly, for example, never moderated on their stances, in many ways has intensified their positions, and never considered reaching some kind of accommodation with what was previously called universalist practice that didn't see the Folkish getting basically everything they wanted. The position of the AFA within the community was only changed when much of the rest of the community stopped tolerating their nonsense with Declaration 127. At the end of the day, the only solution that works is continuous confrontation and building truly inclusive community and society. So, that was this episode on the modern American right. If you enjoyed this content and you want to see more stuff like this and support my work, please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you early access to my podcast content and more benefits as the Patreon grows. So thank you again. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer.